stand up, put your hands behind your back. Just gonna tighten these just a little bit, okay? Don't move. You start twisting your hands, it'll get real tight.
It starts like something out of a bad dream, except this time, it wasn't fiction. Inside an ordinary high school, in the middle of an ordinary week, a plan was quietly taking shape. One so disturbing, so calculated, that even seasoned investigators struggled to process it. What makes it even harder to grasp isn't just what was allegedly planned, it's how casually it was treated. Laughter where there should have been fear, smiles where there should have been regret, and buried beneath it all, a chilling obsession that blurred the line between fantasy and reality in the most dangerous way possible. What makes this case especially unsettling isn't just the alleged plan itself, it's how early the warning signs started showing, and how close everything came to turning into something irreversible. By the time authorities stepped in, this wasn't just speculation or rumor anymore. There were details, there was preparation, there was intent. It all began the night before anything was supposed to happen. Around 11:30 p.m., someone decided not to stay silent. An anonymous tip was sent in, warning that a student, known only by the name Jimmy, was planning to kill another student the very next day. Now, tips like these don't always lead to something serious, but this one stood out immediately. The language was specific. The concern felt real. And more importantly, it referenced prior incidents involving threats connected to the same circle. According to the report, the person who sent the tip believed this wasn't just talk. They mentioned that Jimmy had already been involved with police before, connected to threats made toward the school. There was also mention of a confiscated phone, something that may have escalated the situation emotionally. At that point, investigators weren't just looking at a vague warning, they were looking at a potential escalation. By the time officers began digging deeper, they were able to identify who Jimmy actually was. A 15-year-old student named Isabel Valdez, and almost immediately, her name raised even more concern. She wasn't completely unknown to law enforcement. In fact, she was already being looked into for multiple swatting incidents earlier that same month. Serious false emergency reports that can put entire communities at risk. So now, what started as an anonymous tip had turned into something far more concrete. You have a named individual, a recent pattern of troubling behavior, and a direct warning about a planned act of violence scheduled for the next day. Officers didn't wait. That same night, they went to Valdez's home. The goal at that stage wasn't to accuse, it was to assess. They asked her directly about the alleged target mentioned in the tip. Did she know him? Had she contacted him? Was there anything they should be concerned about? Her response was calm. She denied everything. She told officers she hadn't been in contact with the student and couldn't have been anyway. Her phone had already been taken by police. On the surface, it might have sounded convincing, but given everything already on record, it wasn't enough to close the case. If anything, it raised more questions. Because here's the thing, when a situation involves potential violence, especially in a school setting, investigators don't rely on a single answer. They look for consistency, they look for patterns, and most importantly, they act before it's too late. So the next morning, January 23rd, officers coordinated with school officials at Lake Brantley High School. Instead of causing panic, they handled it quietly. Valdez was pulled out of class, along with her close friend, 14-year-old Lois Lippard. The plan was simple: separate interviews, careful questioning, and a clear understanding of what was really going on. At this point, everything could have still gone either way. It could have been a misunderstanding, a rumor blown out of proportion, something that would be resolved quietly and quickly. But that's not what happened. When Valdez was asked a critical question, whether she had thought about hurting herself or someone else, there was a pause. Not confusion, not denial, a pause. And then she said yes. That single moment changed everything. Because what followed wasn't hesitation or backtracking, it was detail. She told officers she had already written a letter to her parents, something she planned to leave behind after carrying out what she had in mind. That alone signaled premeditation. This wasn't impulsive. This had been thought through. Then came the part that removed any remaining doubt. When officers asked how she intended to hurt the alleged victim, Valdez didn't just describe it, she showed them. Inside her backpack were all the items she claimed she would use: a knife, gloves, trash bags, and wipes. Everything laid out in a way that suggested preparation, not imagination. It wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was real, physical, and ready. And at that moment, the situation crossed a line. This was no longer about what might happen. It was about what was already in motion. Investigators now had a student admitting to a plan, presenting the tools for it, and confirming that it was supposed to happen that very day. The timeline had collapsed into the present. There was no buffer left, no room for delay. But even with all of that, the most disturbing part hadn't surfaced yet. Because as the questioning continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about targeting another student. There was something deeper driving it, something far more difficult to understand, something that turned this case from a planned act of violence into something far more psychologically complex and deeply unsettling. What investigators uncovered next didn't just deepen the case, it completely shifted its gravity. Because this wasn't only about intent or preparation anymore, it was about why. And that answer introduced a level of psychological disturbance that made the situation even more alarming. When Valdez began explaining her motive, it wasn't rooted in conflict, revenge, or even a personal dispute with the alleged target. Instead, she described the student as perfect, someone she had been observing closely, someone who, in her mind, resembled a figure tied to one of the most horrific school tragedies in history. That fixation wasn't casual. It had been building for years. According to her own statements, this fascination started back in middle school, where she became deeply interested in school shooters, particularly the individual responsible for the Sandy Hook tragedy. Over time, that interest didn't fade. It evolved. It turned into something obsessive, something personal. And then came the part that's difficult to process. Valdez claimed she had been hearing voices that told her if she carried out the killing, it would create a kind of bond, a connection that would bring that shooter back to her. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. In her mind, this was real, a blood ritual that would reunite them. That belief wasn't vague or abstract. It directly shaped her alleged plan. She told officers she intended to wait for the target in an upstairs bathroom at the school. The idea was to isolate him, pull him inside, and carry out the attack there, either by stabbing him in the stomach or cutting his throat. It was specific, controlled, planned down to the location. And then, layered on top of that, were details that made it even more disturbing. She said she had flowers with her, flowers she intended to leave behind after the act, almost like a symbolic gesture. Something she described as part of the scene. Afterward, she planned to smoke cigarettes she had brought with her, fully aware that she would likely be arrested. That awareness didn't stop her. If anything, it was already factored into the plan. When asked about consequences, her response was chilling in its simplicity. Jail or a psychiatric facility, it didn't matter. The outcome wasn't the point. The act itself was. Because in her mind, completing that act meant she wouldn't be alone anymore. That belief, combined with preparation and timing, turned what might have been dismissed as fantasy into something dangerously actionable. But investigators weren't just focused on Valdez anymore, because as this picture came together, another name kept coming up: Lois Lippard, her best friend. When questioned, Valdez admitted that she had shared the plan with Lippard. Not in passing, not as a joke. She had explained it, discussed it, and according to her, Lippard knew what was going to happen the next day. So naturally, officers needed to understand just how involved she was. During her interview, Lippard confirmed key details. She acknowledged that Valdez had told her about the plan. But it didn't stop there. She also admitted to helping in ways that moved her from being a passive listener to an active participant. According to the report, Lippard assisted in gathering items. She provided materials that were later found in Valdez's possession: gloves, cigarettes, a lighter, even flowers. And perhaps most concerning, she allegedly helped sharpen the knife that was intended for the attack. At that point, the line between awareness and involvement became very clear. This wasn't someone who simply heard about a plan and dismissed it. This was someone who, at least according to investigators, contributed to its execution. And there was more. Valdez told officers that Lippard had also helped her communicate with others about the plan, especially since her phone had been taken. That meant the idea wasn't completely isolated. It had been shared, discussed, possibly even encouraged in certain spaces. The deeper investigators went, the more structured everything appeared. This wasn't a sudden decision made overnight. Valdez admitted that the idea had first formed nearly 3 months earlier. What changed wasn't the idea, it was the timing, the decision to act. And in the final 24 hours, that plan seemed to solidify with Lippard fully aware of what was coming. There were also indications that the alleged target had been followed, observed, photographed. A camera was recovered from Valdez's bag, supporting her statement that she had been documenting the student beforehand. That level of attention suggested more than curiosity, it suggested fixation. And then there was the online activity. By now, the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone might have expected from an anonymous tip the night before. Investigators were no longer piecing together possibilities. They were looking at a fully formed plan, supported by statements, physical evidence, and corroboration between two individuals. At this stage, there wasn't much left to interpret. There was enough to act, enough to intervene, enough to prevent something that, if carried out, would have left irreversible consequences. So with all of that in hand, officers made a decision. Both students would be taken into custody. And what happened next, captured on body camera footage, would leave people questioning not just the severity of the situation, but the complete lack of seriousness shown by the very individuals at the center of it. By the time officers moved in, there was no ambiguity left. The interviews, the admissions, the physical evidence, it had all converged into one unavoidable conclusion. This wasn't speculation anymore. Action had to be taken. Inside the school, everything was handled with controlled precision. No chaos, no alarms, just a quiet but firm intervention designed to prevent the situation from escalating any further. Body camera footage captures the exact moment it all shifted from investigation to arrest. Valdez is approached first. The tone is calm, almost routine. She's asked to stand up, place her hands behind her back. There's no resistance, no visible panic, just compliance. The kind that, under normal circumstances, might suggest someone fully understands the gravity of what's happening. But here, something feels off. As the handcuffs are secured, officers explain the charge: attempted first-degree premeditated murder. It's a heavy statement, one that carries serious legal weight, one that for most people would trigger fear, confusion, or at the very least, shock. Instead, the reaction is subdued, almost casual. She asks if the cuffs can be loosened slightly, not about the charges, not about what happens next, just a small physical discomfort. It's a detail that might seem insignificant, but in the context of everything else, it stands out. Because it hints at something deeper, a disconnect between the situation and the emotional response you'd expect from it. Moments later, Lippard is also taken into custody. The explanation given to her is clear. Her involvement, helping sharpen the knife, providing materials, places her directly within the scope of the alleged plan. She too is being charged. She too is now part of this unfolding case. And just like that, both are escorted out. Up until this point, everything, while disturbing, still follows a pattern you might expect in a serious criminal investigation. But what happens next is where the case takes a turn that's difficult to rationalize. Because once they're placed in the back of the patrol car, the tone changes completely. The footage shows the two of them sitting side by side, handcuffed, facing charges that could define the rest of their lives. And yet, instead of tension or silence, there's laughter. Actual laughter. They begin talking to each other in a way that feels almost disconnected from reality, joking about whether they'll end up in the same jail, making comments about their appearance, treating the moment like some kind of shared experience rather than a life-altering event. At one point, one of them refers to the situation as a bonding experience. And it doesn't stop there. The conversation drifts into even more unsettling territory. There are comments about the plan itself, spoken about casually, almost flippantly. One of them mentions not feeling guilty for the intended actions, only concerned about how others might react. Another talks about being excited, expecting to be sent to a psychiatric facility instead of jail. There's even a moment where they discuss how they might be perceived, how people will see them, how their story might spread. It's not fear driving the conversation, it's something else entirely. a kind of detachment that makes everything feel even more disturbing. Because while investigators were working to piece together a serious and potentially deadly plot, the individuals at the center of it were treating it like something far less consequential. And then there are the details that slip through in between the laughter. References to the evidence, the bag found in the backpack, the drawings, the admissions made during questioning. There's an awareness of what's been discovered, but no real indication of regret attached to it. At one point, there's even acknowledgement that telling the truth during the interview may have been a mistake. Not because of what it revealed morally, but because of the consequences it triggered legally. That distinction matters, because it suggests that the weight of the situation isn't being measured by the act itself, but by what happens after getting caught. As the conversation continues, the reality of what's unfolding becomes harder to ignore. This isn't just about a prevented crime anymore. It's about mindset, perception, the way something so serious can be processed in a way that seems almost disconnected from its real-world impact. And for anyone watching that footage, that's the part that lingers. Not just what was planned, but how it was treated. Because in those moments, sitting in the back of that patrol car, there's no sign of the gravity you'd expect. No visible understanding of how close things came to going terribly wrong. Just laughter, casual conversation, and a tone that feels completely out of place given everything that led up to it. But even with all of that, investigators weren't done uncovering the full picture. Because beyond the statements, beyond the footage, there was another layer of evidence, something written, something drawn, that would offer a far more intimate look into the mindset behind the alleged plan. And once those details came to light, the case didn't just feel disturbing, it felt deeply unsettling in a way that's hard to put into words. And just when it seemed like the case couldn't get any more disturbing, investigators uncovered what might be the most revealing and unsettling pieces of evidence yet. Because beyond the interviews, beyond the footage, there were writings, personal, detailed, unfiltered. Inside Valdez's backpack, officers reportedly found notes and journal entries that didn't just describe a plan, they immersed you in it. These weren't quick thoughts scribbled in passing, they were structured, emotional, and deeply fixated narratives that blurred the line between fantasy and intent in a way that's hard to ignore. One of those notes was addressed directly to her parents, and reading it feels less like a goodbye, and more like a window into a mindset that had been building over time. She begins by apologizing, acknowledging what she was about to do, while insisting that none of it was their fault. And then, woven into all of that, is the same fixation investigators had already uncovered, the belief that committing this act would reconnect her with the Sandy Hook shooter. Not just symbolically, but as if it would restore a lost bond, as if it would bring back a voice she claimed to miss, a presence she felt had abandoned her. It's not just disturbing, it's deeply revealing. Because it shows that, at least from her perspective, this wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about connection, about devotion, about fulfilling something she believed was larger than herself. And then, there are the journal entries. If the letter to her parents gives you context, the journal pulls you directly into the mindset behind the alleged plan. One entry reads almost like a story, but not in a detached way. It's written in the first person, placing her inside the scenario she had imagined. She describes encountering the target, speaking to him, admiring him. There's a tone that shifts between affection and control, calling him beautiful, while simultaneously describing actions that are violent and calculated. She writes about isolating him, about the moment he becomes aware of what's happening, about the fear in his reaction. And what's most unsettling is how that fear is described, not as something alarming, but as something that fuels the moment, something that heightens it. There's even mention of recording the act, framing it as part of the experience. And throughout it all, there's this consistent thread of admiration, of seeing the victim as something almost delicate, almost idealized, while simultaneously planning to destroy that very image. It's a contradiction that makes the entire narrative even harder to process, because it doesn't follow a pattern most people can easily understand, and it doesn't stop at writing. Investigators also recovered drawings, reportedly created by Lippard, that added another visual layer to the case. Images that depicted violent scenes, figures in distress, and in some cases, representations that seemed to tie back to the same obsession driving the alleged plan. Some drawings showed a male figure in vulnerable or dangerous positions. Others appeared to depict interactions between Valdez and the shooter she was fixated on. And then there were captions, phrases that echoed the same themes found in the journal entries: admiration, control, obsession. Taken together, the writings and drawings didn't just support what investigators had already heard, they expanded it. They offered a deeper look into the emotional and psychological framework behind the alleged plot. And at that point, the case becomes something more than just a prevented act of violence. It becomes a study in how far a mindset can drift when it's left unchecked. Now, from a legal standpoint, everything that's been uncovered, every statement, every item recovered, every note, becomes part of the larger case moving forward. Both Valdez and Lippard have since appeared in court. They've entered not guilty pleas to the charges against them, and those charges are serious. For Valdez, they include attempted first-degree premeditated murder, attempted felony murder, armed burglary, attempted aggravated child abuse with a deadly weapon, possession of a weapon on school property, and aggravated stalking. All of this evidence, the interviews, the body cam footage, the writings, the drawings, could ultimately be presented in front of a jury. Each piece forming part of a much larger narrative that prosecutors will likely use to establish intent, preparation, and involvement. But beyond the legal process, there's a bigger conversation here. Because cases like this force you to confront uncomfortable questions, not just about how something like this develops, but about how it goes unnoticed for so long. And that's the part that stands out the most. Because while everything else in this case is disturbing, the plan, the mindset, the evidence, the outcome could have been far worse. It didn't happen, and that matters. But it also leaves you thinking about how close it came, how a normal school day almost became something else entirely, and how sometimes the difference between those two realities comes down to whether someone decides to say something or stays silent. If you made it this far, you already know, this isn't the kind of story you just watch and move on from. It stays with you. So go ahead and hit like if you want more deep dives like this. Subscribe for more real cases broken down step by step. And share this with someone who needs to see just how real these situations can get. And I want to hear from you. What do you think stood out the most in this case? Was it the planning, the mindset, or the reaction after the arrest? Drop your thoughts in the comments.